Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining today's Lunch Break Live with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Jenny Beth Martin. In just a moment, we'll go to Bill Pasco for our Washington Report. Before we do that, please take a moment to share this Facebook Live or YouTube or Rumble video, however you're watching it, with your friends so they can get the report from Washington. And then while you're watching the Washington Report, if you have any questions at all, feel free to shoot me an email. And you can email me at jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. Again, that's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. And now we're going to go to Bill Pasco for our Washington Report.
Thank you, Jenny Beth. The House is in recess this week and will return on Monday, April 29. The Senate will come in Tuesday for a series of votes and then will go on recess until Monday, April 29. Last week in the House returned on Monday. First up was a motion to reconsider the bill the House had passed on Friday, the reauthorization of Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The House voted to table that motion. That is, the House voted to kill it by a vote of 259 to 128, with 43 members not voting. Then the House passed 3 bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, the House took up and passed a rule governing floor consideration of several bills having to do with Iran. Then the House took up and passed 9 bills dealing with Iran under suspension of the rules. On Wednesday, the House took up an amendment to H.R. 4639, the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act. It passed. Then the House took up and passed the bill as amended by a vote of 219 to 199. Then the House took up and passed several more bills regarding Iran. H.R. 6046, the Standing Against Houthi Aggression Act. H.R. 4691, the Iran Sanctions Relief Review Act. H.R. 5947, to provide for the rescission of certain waivers and licenses relating to Iran. And H.R. 6323, the Iran Counterterrorism Act. On Thursday, the House voted by 404 to 14 to pass H.Res. 1143, condemning Iran's unprovoked drone and missile attack on Israel. On Friday, the House took up the rule governing floor consideration of the multiple bill national security package, H.R. 8034, the Israel Security Supplemental Appropriations Act, H.R. 8035, the Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act, H.R. 8036, the Indo-Pacific Security Supplemental Appropriations Act, and H.R. 8038, the 21st Century Peace Through Strength Act. In a rare move, significant numbers of the minority party crossed party lines to vote in favor of the rule. So even though 55 Republicans voted against it, it ended up passing with an overwhelming margin of 316 to 94. The party breakdown on the rule vote, for those of you following this matter closely, was 151 in favor and 55 against among Republicans, 165 in favor and 39 against among Democrats. So across the board, it was almost 3-1 in favor of passing the rule. That set the stage for a rare Saturday session for the House. First up, the House took up H.R. 3602, the End the Border Catastrophe Act, under suspension of the rules. It earned a majority of the votes, 215 to 199, but because it had been brought up under suspension of the rules, it needed a 2/3 majority to pass, and therefore it failed. Then the House took up H.R. 8038, the 21st Century Peace Through Strength Act. First up was an amendment, which was agreed to. Then the House voted to pass H.R. 8038, the 21st Century Peace Through Strength Act, by a vote of 360 to 58. Next up was H.R. 8036, the Indo-Pacific Security Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2024. It passed by a vote of 385 to 34. Then the House moved to consideration of H.R. 8035, the Ukraine Security Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2024. There were several amendments in order. First up was an amendment offered by Republican Congresswoman Victoria Spartz of Indiana to strike several sections of the bill. Essentially, she was striking funds going to Ukraine. The amendment failed. Next was an amendment offered by Georgia Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene to reduce every dollar amount in the bill to zero. That amendment failed. Then came an amendment offered by Republican Congresswoman Kat Kamak of Florida to eliminate all non-military funding to Ukraine, which was also defeated. Then, having considered and defeated the three proposed amendments, the House voted to pass H.R. 8035, the Ukraine Security Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2024, by a vote of 311 to 112, with 101 Republicans voting in favor and 112 voting against. Then the House took up and passed H.R. 8034, the Israel Security Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2024, by a vote of 366 to 58, and then they were done. Last week in the Senate returned on Monday and voted against tabling the nomination of Ramona Villagomez Manglona to be a judge for the District Court for the Northern Mariana Islands. Then the Senate voted to invoke cloture on her nomination. On Tuesday, the Senate voted to confirm her to that position. Then the Senate voted to agree to the motion to proceed to legislative session, a bill to prohibit the use of funds to implement, administer, or enforce certain rules for the Environmental Protection Agency. Then the Senate received and heard read aloud the two articles of impeachment against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. On Wednesday, the Senate convened as an impeachment court. The Senate President pro tem, Democrat Senator Patty Murray of Washington, was sworn in by the senior Republican in the Senate, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa. Then Senator Murray swore in the rest of the Senate as jurors en masse. And then, in groups of four, in alphabetical order, the remaining senators went down to the well of the Senate to sign an oath book swearing that they would do impartial justice in the matter. Senate Majority Leader Schumer then explained the unanimous consent request that he wanted to offer the body. Missouri Republican Eric Schmitt objected, so the unanimous consent request was off the table. Then Schumer followed by raising a point of order, quote, "I raise a point of order that Impeachment Article 1 does not allege conduct that rises to the level of a high crime or misdemeanor, as required under Article 2, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution, and is therefore unconstitutional," end quote. Senator Murray, presiding over the floor, said that under the precedents and practices of the Senate, the chair had no power or authority to pass on such a point of order and therefore submitted the question to the Senate. And then the motions began. First, by a vote of 49 to 51, the Senate rejected a motion to close the doors offered by Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz so they could discuss matters. Then Louisiana Republican Senator John Kennedy offered a motion to adjourn the court of impeachment until 12 noon on Tuesday, April 30. That motion was similarly defeated, 49 to 51. Then Minority Leader Mitch McConnell offered a motion to adjourn. That was defeated by a vote of 49 to 51. 3 swings, 3 strikes. The Republicans struck out on their attempt to defeat Schumer's attempt to block the Senate from having to vote on the first article of impeachment. So then the Senate voted on whether or not Schumer's point of order was well taken, and to the surprise of absolutely no one, the Senate voted by 51 to 48, with one senator, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, voting present to say that the point of order was well taken. So by simple majority vote, The Senate determined that the first article of impeachment was unconstitutional, and therefore the Senate did not even have to have a trial about it. Having succeeded in dismissing the first article of impeachment so easily, Schumer moved to the second article of impeachment, the article that charged Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas with having lied to the Congress. Schumer said exactly the same thing, that the article does not allege conduct that rises to the level of a high crime or misdemeanor and is therefore unconstitutional. And we went through the same exercise all over again, except this time the Republicans were really steamed. Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee was the one who objected. Quote, "As wrong as the majority leader was moments ago in making this particular point of order as to Article 1, the impeachment article, Article 1, remember, refers to the willful defiance by Secretary Mayorkas of the law. As wrong as he was in making that as to Article 1, and he was very wrong for the reasons articulated moments ago by the senator from Texas, he is even more wrong, far more so, with respect to Article 2, because Article 2 accuses him of knowingly making false statements. This is a violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 1001, a felony offense. If this is not a high crime and misdemeanor, what is? If this is not impeachable, what is? What precedent will be set? We need to address this and to discuss it. We need to discuss it in closed session," end quote. And then Senator Lee moved that the Senate proceed to closed session to allow for deliberation. By a vote of 49 to 51, the motion failed. Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott then offered a motion to adjourn until 12 noon on Tuesday, April 30. His motion was defeated by a vote of 49 to 51. So Louisiana Republican Senator John Kennedy came back for a second bite at the apple and offered a motion to adjourn until 12 noon on Wednesday, May 1, except he inadvertently said 2004 when he meant to say 2024. The moment provided some levity. Asked if he would modify his motion, he responded, 2004 would probably be preferable, but I will accept a friendly amendment that we make it 2024. Despite the laughter, the motion failed by a vote of 49 to 51. Then Kansas Republican Senator Dr. Roger Marshall offered a motion to adjourn until 7 a.m. on November 6, 2024, quote, "so the American people can at least have a vote on this impeachment trial," end quote. His motion failed by a vote of 49 to 51. Alaska Republican Senator Dan Sullivan asked a parliamentary inquiry if the presiding officer was aware of any previous time a successfully invoked point of order had been used to dispose of an article of impeachment prior to opening arguments by the House managers. Senator Murray said the chair is not aware of any such occurrence, to which Sullivan responded, "Thank you, Madam President. Uncharted territory." Kennedy tried yet again. "Madam President," he said, "before we establish a precedent that lying to the U.S. Congress is not a felony, and before we add a new chapter to the movie Pulp Fiction, I move that we go into executive session to at least allow us to talk about the breathtaking precedent we are about to establish here." His motion to go into executive session failed by a vote of 49 to 51. South Dakota Republican Senator John Thune, the minority whip, offered a motion to table the Schumer point of order. His motion failed by a vote of 49 to 51. Texas's other Republican Senator John Cornyn raised a new parliamentary inquiry. Quote, "I inquire whether the actions we take today are creating a precedent on impeachments that would apply to all future impeachment actions in the Senate, including an impeachment of the President of the United States," end quote. The presiding officer responded, "Impeachment precedents would apply in future impeachment hearings," end quote. Then the Senate voted to decide whether Schumer's point of order against the second article of impeachment was well taken. And by a vote of 51 to 49, the Senate determined that making a false statement to Congress was not an impeachable offense. Majority Leader Schumer, having won his battle by simple math, then moved to adjourn the court of impeachment. By a vote of 51 to 49, the Senate agreed to do so, and they were done for the day. On Thursday, the Senate took up H.R. 7888, the FISA Section 702 reauthorization bill that passed the House last week. By a vote of 67 to 32, the Senate voted to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed. Then, by a vote of 46 to 52, the Senate defeated passage of S. 4072, a bill to prohibit the use of funds to implement, administer, or enforce certain rules of the Environmental Protection Agency. On Friday, the Senate agreed to a motion to proceed to H.R. 7888, the FISA Section 702 reauthorization bill. The Senate, by a vote of 31 to 61, rejected an amendment offered by Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul to append the language of the Fourth Amendment is not for sale Act. Then, by a vote of 17 to 75, the Senate rejected an amendment offered by Kansas Republican Senator Dr. Roger Marshall to strike the prohibition on political appointees being involved in the approval of queries by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Then, by a vote of 34 to 58, the Senate rejected an amendment offered by Oregon Democrat Senator Ron Wyden to strike Section 25 relating to the definition of electronic communication service provider. Then, by a vote of 11 to 81, the Senate rejected an amendment offered by Senator Paul to prohibit the use of authorities under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 to surveil United States persons, to prohibit queries under terms associated with United States persons, and to prohibit the use of information acquired under such act in any criminal, civil, or administrative proceeding, or as part of any criminal, civil, or administrative investigation. Then, by a vote of 42 to 50, the Senate rejected an amendment offered by Illinois Democrat Senator Dick Durbin to prohibit warrantless access to the communications and other information of United States persons. And then, by a vote of 43 to 50, the Senate rejected an amendment offered by Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee to appropriately address the use of amici curiae in foreign intelligence surveillance court proceedings and to require adequate disclosure of relevant information in Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 applications. Then, finally, at 11:45 p.m. Friday night, just 15 minutes before the authority would expire, the Senate voted by 60 to 34 to pass the bill reauthorizing Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. This week in the Senate will come back Tuesday with the first vote set for 1 p.m. At that time, the Senate will proceed to 2 roll call votes. The first will be a vote to table the Schumer amendment tree in relation to the House message to accompany H.R. 815, the National Security Supplemental Appropriations Act. The second will be a vote on the motion to concur in the House message to accompany H.R. 815, the National Security Supplemental Appropriations Act. Absent a time agreement, the Senate will likely finish up its work on the Emergency Supplemental National Security Package Wednesday around dinner time. With a time agreement, they could be done tomorrow afternoon. One last thing on that FISA reauthorization. President Biden signed into law the Section 702 reauthorization bill that passed the Senate Friday night, so the authority has been extended for 2 years. Now let's talk more about the Emergency Supplemental Aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan National Security Act. After 6 months of deliberation, Speaker Johnson decided to split the Supplemental National Security Bill into 4 different bills, and then hold individual votes on each of them under a rule that would automatically recombine them at the end, assuming they each passed separately. That decision, announced last week, was criticized by many as being crazy. Well, it turned out to be not such a crazy idea after all. Some members of the House Republican Conference were outraged. Georgia's Marjorie Taylor Greene, Speaker Johnson's most fervent critic, responded by drafting outrageous amendments. For example, one amendment she drafted for the Ukraine supplemental spending bill simply read, quote, "Insert at the appropriate place, any member of Congress who votes in favor of this act shall be required to conscript in the Ukrainian military," end quote. I assume she meant enroll or enlist, because requiring someone to conscript in the Ukrainian military in compulsory fashion, which is what conscript means, would be a violation of international law. In the end, though, Speaker Johnson had the last laugh. H.R. 8038, the 21st Century Peace Through Strength Act, was the GOP grab bag bill, which combined a revised version of the anti-TikTok bill, the Repo Act, which allows the U.S. government to use seized Russian assets to fund Ukraine's defense against Russia's invasion, and a Lend-Lease bill to convert part of the U.S. assistance to Ukraine into a loan. That bill won 360 votes, with vast majorities of both parties voting for it. H.R. 8036, the Indo-Pacific Security Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2024, provides $8.12 billion to help Taiwan defend itself against communist China and reinvigorate U.S. submarine building capacity. That bill earned 385 votes. H.R. 8035, the Ukraine Security Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2024, provides $60.84 billion in defense funding to Ukraine. That bill earned 311 votes in the House. H.R. 8034, the Israel Security Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2024, provides $26.38 billion in defense funding to Israel and funding for humanitarian assistance in Gaza. The bill earned 366 votes. So 4 bills, 360 votes, 385 votes, 311 votes, and 366 votes. That's a pretty strong showing, a supermajority of the House in each case. The bill now goes to the Senate, which will consider it Tuesday. Yet it may yield a motion to vacate. Let's talk about that for a moment. By putting on the floor a bill providing emergency supplemental foreign aid to Ukraine to help it defend itself against Russia's unprovoked aggression. In other words, by moving legislation that allows the United States to live up to a guarantee it gave Ukraine back in the mid-1990s, when in the early years following the breakup of the Soviet Union, as part of an agreement to get Ukraine to give up what was then the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, the United States government committed to defending Ukraine against Russian forces if necessary. Speaker Mike Johnson may have made himself vulnerable to an effort to oust him from his position. You'll recall that 2 weeks ago, Georgia Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene introduced a motion to vacate, the same parliamentary maneuver that was used by Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz against former Speaker Kevin McCarthy last year. Greene introduced the motion to vacate, but did not make it a privileged resolution. If she had done so, the leadership would have been required to put the motion on the floor for a vote within 2 days. But she didn't, so they didn't. And it was just sort of hanging out there like a ghost. Last week, Kentucky Republican Congressman Thomas Massie added his name to the motion to vacate as a co-sponsor. Like Greene, he did not try to bring it to the floor. But this was significant. Massie is a member of the Rules Committee, which used to be known as the Speaker's Committee in a previous time because it was how the Speaker controlled the floor action. Then Arizona Republican Congressman Paul Gosar added his name as a co-sponsor. And then Steve Bannon, who served for a time as former President Trump's campaign and White House strategist, called for Johnson to be dumped. It goes without saying that a successful motion to vacate would likely lead to chaos in the House again. There's no reason to believe House Republicans would find it any easier to settle on a replacement for Johnson than they found it to settle on Johnson as a replacement for McCarthy. In fact, given that with resignations in the middle of their terms, there are now fewer Republicans in the House than there were last year when McCarthy was deposed, House Republicans might find it even harder to settle on a replacement. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries has indicated that Democrats might decide to vote to keep Johnson in place if the motion to vacate ever does come to the floor. Or Democrats could simply not vote. And by not voting, they could keep Johnson in place for the rest of this Congress. Because while Greene, Massie, and Gosar may be determined to throw Johnson out of office, I'd be willing to bet my last dollar that sentiment isn't shared by the majority of the House Republican Conference. Greene, Massie, and Gosar know that, So they're trying to convince Johnson to give up the job on his own by resigning. They think the pressure is going to grow and grow and grow, and they hope he'll decide to short-circuit the process of removing him by doing their job for them. I don't think that's likely to happen, but this has been a strange Congress, so who knows? Stay tuned. Now to this week's episode of Anti-Trump Lawfare. Two things. First, the Manhattan bookkeeping trial kicks into high gear today with opening arguments. Last week was all about jury selection, and that task has now been finished with a dozen jurors and 6 alternates ready to go. So today the opening arguments will be heard, and we know the first witness will be David Pecker, who was the CEO of the National Enquirer's parent company at the time of the alleged offenses. Second, on Thursday, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in the Florida case over former President Trump's claim to immunity from prosecution for actions he took as president. Stay tuned on that. Now let's talk briefly about the latest on the campaign trail 2024. NBC News released a new survey yesterday indicating that President Trump leads President Biden in a one-on-one contest by 46 to 44%, a 2-point lead inside the margin of error, down from the 5-point 48 to 43% lead that he enjoyed a month ago. And that's our Washington report for this week.
Bill, thank you so much for that Washington report. We do not have a call to action this week. We are updating all of our calls to action, and we are just pausing and will not have a call to action this week. You can go to teapartypatriots.org for any updates that we might have, and also follow us closely on social media. And we will be back with you again next week for Tea Party Patriots Lunch Break Live. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you then.